Of course, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is central to the Christian faith. And the question is, can we demonstrate historically that Jesus actually lived, that he was indeed crucified, that he was buried, and that he rose from the dead? Travis, we want to explore the case for the historical Jesus. And I think it's actually interesting that there are New Testament scholars who are non-believers. And could you tell me what are some of the facts that these critical New Testament scholars accept to be true about the historical Jesus?
I'm really glad that you raised the question that way. It's very important that unbelievers understand that New Testament criticism is rife with unbelieving scholars. Most of the scholars that I'm thinking of who accept the facts surrounding Jesus and what he did don't think that Jesus rose from the dead. They don't think that the New Testament is fundamentally reliable as an historical document. They see it as a collection of disparate and contradictory texts from authors, in many cases that we don't even know who the authors are. And so it's interesting that these critical scholars, from liberal to moderate to conservative, have reached a consensus on who Jesus was, or at least various facts about what he did. So, for example, most critical scholars will say that Jesus really did exist. Most critical scholars will say that Jesus was a good and profound moral teacher. Most critical scholars will say that the historical Jesus had disciples. Most scholars believe that Jesus did extraordinary things during his ministry, like healings. Most scholars grant that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah of Israel, and many scholars will add that he claimed to be the unique Son of God. The majority of critical scholars will say that Jesus was crucified by the orders of Pontius Pilate. The majority of scholars believe that Jesus' corpse was buried in a tomb. It was given a proper burial by Joseph of Arimathea. And most scholars, believe it or not, believe that Jesus' tomb was later found empty by a group of his women followers. Almost all scholars, atheistic, theistic, what have you, will say that the disciples had experiences with Jesus as a living reality sometime after his death. And then all scholars will say that the disciples sincerely came to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead and that faith experience was life-changing for them.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. I'm surprised that again, critical New Testament scholars actually go to that extent. So what kind of criteria do these scholars use to establish these 10 facts?
Well, there are four main ones, and there are disputes between scholars over the strengths of these criteria. But the number one criteria would be the criterion of multiple independent attestation. If you have a statement of Jesus or an event in the Gospels or an event that's described in the New Testament that is attested in more than one source, written or oral, then that raises the probability that that event happened. So, for example, the idea that Jesus was crucified, as I've said before, is multiply attested because we find it in Paul. John is clearly writing off a different tradition than Mark, so we have it multiply attested in Mark, John, and Paul. We also find the crucifixion in Josephus. So the crucifixion is very well attested from multiple sources. The criterion of embarrassment is another criterion that is appealed to among scholars. It's very unlikely that the later church is going to create a story that would be the cause of its own embarrassment. And probably the best example of this would be Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. John the Baptist was going about baptizing people for the remission of sins, and yet Jesus comes to John and is baptized by him. Well, later Christian theology came to the conclusion that Jesus was a sinless person. So it's very unlikely that the church would just invent the story of John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, because that kind of story tends to raise the question, well, was Jesus really sinless? And that's why most scholars will say that story about Jesus being baptized by John is authentic. It really happened. There's the criterion of coherence. Once we establish a core group of facts about who Jesus was, then when we find stories that cohere well with the established facts about Jesus, then that raises the probability that this event is true. And then finally, there's the criterion of dissimilarity. If we find a statement of Jesus, for example, that cannot be paralleled or found in early Judaism or later Christian theology, then Jesus probably said something like that. And so these criteria are used when the New Testament scholar goes into the data, and from that data, they sift through what is more likely to happen than not, and they come to the conclusion that, yes, this is factual, or this is not well evidenced. Now, one of the most important things to note about these criteria, if a statement of Jesus doesn't pass one of these criteria, that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus did not say it. It simply means that it's not well evidenced. And so that's an important point to keep as we go throughout the study.